Hello everyone, thank you for being here today. I think we just wanted to start by saying that we're also very happy for this to be as much of a conversation as you would like, and obviously we can answer questions afterwards as well, but please don't hesitate if, as we're talking, anything's unclear or you have a burning question, just interject, and we're happy to make it quite a kind of intimate conversation that way. So, as Sean was saying, Joe has recently been shortlisted for this Canadian prize, and that's actually how we met originally. I was invited to her studio to help shoot her video, and the person who was supposed to be interviewing her had a horrible cough and was sort of losing her voice. And so halfway through the interview, we swapped positions, and ended up having such an interesting conversation that at the end of it, she invited me out to be a part of this conversation. So hopefully it'll be just as interesting. I thought, this is quite brilliant. I didn't realize until a couple of days ago that we'd be doing it in the gallery space, which is quite wonderful because we can talk about the work and look at the work at the same time. This is my first time seeing the show installed here, and I think it's quite just a beautiful exhibition, and I can't really imagine a more perfect space for the work. I thought we might start, Joe, by talking a little bit about A to Z, since that was such a kind of foundational piece for the rest of the show. Could you tell us a little bit about how that piece came about?
Yes, well, I've been working for about 6 years or so with dogs, and I've made a very large body of work, and that piece of work started from a very particular study I did of British show dogs, and I found it really useful to have this kind of piece of work that was a sounding board for all the other works that I made in that series. So when I moved on to work with elite gymnasts, I thought it would be interesting to kind of take a similar approach, but I didn't want to repeat myself. I didn't want to, with the previous work I approached all the best whippet breeders in Britain and asked them to bring their best dogs to me, and then I photographed them in a formal show pose, how a breeder would look at a dog. So I wanted to understand their thinking and how they approached the idea of the image of a dog. And I felt for the gymnasts, it was both not so easy to do that, but I also thought maybe not so appropriate. Gymnastics is a kind of an amazing discipline. It's been around for hundreds of years, and it's a very essential activity using the human body. And I thought that the way that most people experience gymnastics, apart from the few keen gymnasts and those that follow gymnastics, is through photography. So it's a very captivating sport, it's a very visual sport, and most of our experiences of it is mediated by the lens of a camera, either a TV camera or most commonly a press photographer's camera. And it's a very particular kind of photography. It's not, photography is a very multifaceted thing. It can be anything, it can be many things. Sports photography is a very particular thing. It's not so much that there are rules, but there are common constraints that all the photographers work under. Gymnasts move very fast. They're recording and documenting a competition, usually. So most of the photography is there to document a particular gymnast or moment or competition as a narrative or a trajectory to that documentation. But also it's a commercial thing. So most of the press photographers would either be assigned to a particular federation, a national federation, so they'd be there to represent that country's gymnasts and make a document for them. Or they would be press photographers who'd be there either assigned to a newspaper or freelance selling the images. And I decided that I would, as my starting point, look at the work of professional sports photographers and see how they came to photograph gymnastics. And I wanted to understand what we currently have out there and what we most often look at. And so it started as almost a conceptual piece. I decided how would I do that, how would I frame it? And I decided that I would try and gather together press photographs which showed images of moves was named after the gymnast who invented them. So it was kind of, and I kind of started, it was actually a commission as well. It was a commission from Pavilion, who are a Leeds organisation. And it was a national competition, and I was shortlisted and invited for the shortlist to then do a presentation to the judging panel. And it was only at that point that I realised that probably most of these images are actually owned by Getty, Corbis. And, you know, the images that we're really familiar with, or I was from my youth, all been bought up and owned by other people. But even so, for this presentation, I just made a very long list of all the moves that I could think of, the very famous moves, and I also, out of interest, wrote down the nationality of the gymnast and the era. And there was this kind of strange trajectory where you could see the kind of power relations in international world politics shifting. So the very, a lot of the early 50s and 60s, you have a lot of Japanese, very famous Japanese male gymnasts. All the Eastern European bloc countries were very prominent, particularly Czechoslovakia and Soviet Union, Russia, Romania. And then slowly the Americans appeared on the scene. The Chinese very late in the day because they didn't compete in the Olympics till very late on. And it was very interesting to see these shifts. And now it's much more multifaceted. There are very high quality gymnasts all over the world, probably reflecting the fact that a lot of coaches from these very well supported countries have now moved across the world and are coaching elsewhere. So this piece, I gathered together all the images I could from a whole variety of different sources, from museum archives, press archives. The official photographer to the International Gymnastics Federation gave me access to all his archive. Some propaganda books, eBay was very good. A lot of the Soviet propaganda publishing, Progress Publishing doesn't exist anymore, but they had a lot of very amazing 50s and 60s and 70s photography. So I gathered it all together and then I started working with the images. And the biggest dilemma for me was I had these thousands of images and how to make it mine. You know, what was I going to do with them? So first of all, trying to clusterify the particular moves. I also realised that there was a peak moment that the photographers always seemed to go for. So an extended moment, often with the hands and legs always kind of pointed and sharp. And certain moves, you know that they're quite interesting moves, but they were always photographed at one particular moment. So the Corbett flip, which is up there, is always captured at that moment where she's arching her back and leaping off the back bar. You never see her actually standing on the bar. So
no, there's a kind of photographic convention that's decided that that's the kind of iconic.
That's obviously the image that either looks best or sells best. You know, I wasn't sure which, but there was certainly a repetition. And what was quite fascinating was over time, and the images here span over 90 years, but over time there wasn't such a difference in what that peak moment might be. I mean, everything else changed slowly. The camera technology changed, the equipment the gymnasts were using changed. You could see it evolve from clunky wooden horses through to these super fine, streamlined.
There's a particular example that you showed me today. Is it a pommel horse?
It's the vaulting horse.
It's the vaulting horse. It's sort of right in the center of the piece as well. And there's a very old-fashioned black and white image on the bottom, and on the top is a very modern vault. And a very modern costume, a very modern gymnast, and in full color, obviously. But the pose is identical. So.
And with a little digital scoreboard with the vaulting and reading. And so you have this kind of this evolution of camera technologies. The bodies change. The bodies become more honed and muscular. Some of the early ones, got really quite soft, rounded bodies. But what I wanted to do is I clustered it together, so the decades all clustered together. It's all about the move, and you see this very slow evolution, not through seconds, which is the traditional way of looking at movement in photography. Is back to Muybridge and his study of human movement, where you had cameras that would capture split-second movement, and you could see how the movement evolved. Here I've got images over decades, but performing similar moves or moves that have evolved. So it was a starting point. It was made in the end very quickly for the opening of the show by the time I got the images together. And I made it originally on MDF, very simply block mounted. And for Moscow I decided to remake it under Perspex. I was interested to see what that might add to it. It's just it's the same piece but different. There's an aspect as you move through, almost get a doubling of the image of the Perspex, and it adds a certain movement to it.
How did you arrive at the geometry of the sort of flow of
the actual flow? First of all, once I'd edited to a certain, all the clusters,
yes.
I played around with the idea of having different sizes, but I decided, because gymnastics is such a controlled discipline, there's rules and regulations, I wanted to set myself my own rules and regulations. So I decided that all the blocks would be the same width.
Yes.
But then whatever, I didn't crop them, these are cropped as the sports photographers crop them.
Yes.
And so they'd be whatever height the image they came in at. But between the images, there is actually a grid, which is less apparent with the Perspex version than with the original version.
Right.
It's a very strict grid where there's just, I think it's 5mm gap, horizontally and vertically between each of the blocks. Having said that, I made each of the clusters into a cluster visually. Just I played with colour and line and movement, and I just indulged myself. I worked with each cluster, and then I clustered the clusters. And I knew that I wanted it to be some kind of, because it's called A to Z, I was hinting at the fact that this is a system. You know,
yes.
It's a description, it's a code, it's a way of looking at something. And I wanted, in my mind, I pictured the alphabet as a line, so I wanted to mirror that in some way. But I also wanted it to somehow, you know, it's presented without text. You don't need to know who the gymnasts are or what countries they come from, although it's kind of all in there. And I know the key gymnasts will probably recognise a few of those gymnasts performing. There's a lot of very famous people there. But it's actually all about the bodies and the movement. So I wanted it to work on its own without any text. So I clustered it according to the movement and the flow of the movement. And then being an artist, I kind of fractured my own system. So it's a kind of tight rules system, but then I kind of did it by eye as well. So, which makes it quite difficult to install, as Richard will testify to. We had to fiddle around with ages and get it right. So it's an artist system. It's both systematic and rigorous, but with a little bit of leeway and artistic license.
Yes, definitely.
And I worked with colour and body shape. And I also added in, apart from the named moves, I also added in clusters with the key body movements like the pike, the straddle, the tuck, things that are essential to gymnastics.
Well, it operates in such an interesting way in relation to the rest of the work of the show, because it functions for a viewer, I think, as a kind of index in a certain way, because it hints at all of these other things that are going on to more or less degrees in a lot of other pieces, a lot of which you've mentioned a little bit. But I thought I would ask particularly about your almost obsession, if I can call it that, with the notion of perfection, which I think is so interesting, is interesting in a totally different way with this work than with the dog work. Are people familiar with Joe's earlier work, which is not on view here? Has everyone seen? Do you want to talk just a little bit about the refusal, your earlier body of work?
Yes, I worked with whippet breeders, and these were particular breeders breeding dogs for the show ring. So for them, there really was an ideal dog that they were trying to produce. And the Kennel Club has a description of the whippet breed standard, which actually is written and describes what a perfect whippet would look like. But it's all words, so it's like, what does a perfect whippet look like? Which is why I asked them to bring their champion dogs to me, and I photographed them. Of course, they're all different. So my first piece there, 12 Dogs, 12 Bitches, presented back to a different audience, not a dog show audience. this particular obsessive hobby subculture's idea of what a perfect dog might look like. And then I produced a variety of other pieces of work that then responded to this quite clinical, formal pose. I made my own works which probably explored more our relationship with the dogs and the kind of sentient creatures that they are. So you can see those works on my website. You can see them. The works on the refusal.
And this work, I think, was in some way an attempt at extending this investigation into, the way that we define perfection somehow, the way that particular subcultures determine what these ideals are, and that, of course, relates to how photographers are implicit in this role, how they decide, what a perfect pose is. But what's really interesting to me in this work is the total disconnect between sort of what can be considered maybe not perfect, but interesting at least in a photograph, which is very different from the sort of idea of the perfect pose. So then, which relates to most of the rest of the work in the show, which I think chooses quite different moments and not oft photographed moments of these gymnastic poses.
I definitely wanted to look at this idea of what a perfect photograph of a gymnast might be, and certainly in sports photography, there is an idea of what is a good shot.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the gymnasts I worked with, their coaches, also had a very clear idea of what a good shot might be. And I felt that was quite predictable, and we're so familiar with it. I wanted to. Gymnastics is such an amazing discipline. There's so much energy and passion and training and hard work that goes into it.
Which, for those who don't know, Jo trained as a gymnast for a number of years, which is
a very long time. But it's something that is almost hidden, particularly with the female gymnasts. And the female gymnasts historically have been far more famous than their male counterparts. But quite often, if you look at the A to Z again, you see that the male gymnasts are often presented in strength holds. You see their endurance and their strength very clearly presented, whereas the female gymnasts, somehow they're encouraged to make it look effortless. And not exactly easy, because we marvel at their feats, but it's kind of glamorous and effortless, and those years of rigorous training are somehow disguised. And for me, that's also really interesting. I was most interested with the gymnasts in not the physical perfection of their performance, not their bodies. So with the dogs, originally their bodies were the starting point, these perfect specimens bred by us to look at. But with the gymnasts, I was far more interested in the psyche, the emotion, what drives them, what keeps these young girls usually training for days and months and years on end, repeating moves and performances just to try and pull off that one perfect performance on the night, which might just come right for a big competition and produce a gold medal or a championship win. So I was far more interested in the emotional and physical experience rather than the physical physique.
Yes.
And I don't think that's shown so much. I think you often see kind of catastrophic falls or failures. You don't see that kind of all those other moments which happen but which aren't shown or thought to be worthy of being shown. So particularly with the Space Force constructions, which were actually all shot at the World Championships. So these are all
these pieces.
The pieces in the metal frameworks. These are all elite gymnasts in the vaulting finals of the World Championships. So they're no slouches, and they're actually in mid-performance. This is in competition, and yet there's some amazing things that go on. Some amazing moments where they don't hold those poses that we're normally shown. So I wanted to present it to us differently, just to kind of maybe open up an opportunity to think about all those other things that go on. Maybe those, you know, the competition is very tense and demanding, but also there's an amazing feeling in performance of physicality and floating and being. And, you know, the driver gymnast has to pull that off, and I wanted to try and capture some of that as well. And I think I tried to make these images ambiguous, so they could be difficult moments or they could be wonderful moments. I don't want it to be quite so clear. So to give the viewers something to
whether it's
contemplate.
a successful or a success or a failure, the movie itself, you can't actually tell from these moments whether they were in good form or not.
Yes.
They wouldn't.
And I was also really interested in those. I think these images would definitely be. I was there with the World's Press, and obviously I was using similar equipment. And again, the question was, how do I make this mine? What can I show that's different? What do I want to show that's different? And I found the gymnast's hands and feet was so expressive.
Yes.
I mean, there's something, you know, every pose or gesture or thing, you know, is expressed there. And I was particularly interested not to create a classic portrait with the face sharply in focus. It's not about the celebrity or the, you know, these are famous gymnasts, but it's not about them as an individual famous gymnast. It's about them as an individual producing something and just looking at their hands and feet rather than their faces.
But there's something also which you mentioned when you were talking about A to Z, which is expanded on in these, which is the politics. That's also kind of inherent in a lot of the imagery, and that's to a certain extent found in the title of the piece. They're all called space and forest construction, but in brackets you name the country that they're from, and of course it's also related to these geometric constructions that you've made to hold them and to project them into the space.
Yes, I mean, when I made these pieces, I was thinking about lots of different things. And if you get a chance to look in the book, you can see some of my sketchbooks reproduced, which show some of my kind of early thinking. And one of the things that really interested me was ideas of perfection, but not just physical perfection, but ideas of perfect societies and utopias. And I was looking at the constructivists, so the really early days of the Russian Revolution, and how they harnessed a lot of artists and architects to get on board and build new architectures and new ways of thinking, new visual ideas that would help engender a kind of a more equal society, a society where everybody was involved. And so, and obviously the most famous of those, Rodchenko and Popova, produced a lot of, and also Tatlin and his architectural tower. There was a lot of geometry involved and a lot of architectural structure. They disavowed painting, so painting was very bourgeois, and instead they had these more geometric works using materials that were readily available. And so I was looking at all these early works, and they're works which we're all really familiar with now because they, you know, Rodchenko's work was harnessed and kind of really was the birth of advertising, I guess. Very strong graphic images, but also the colours are kind of synonymous with revolution and communism. And when I was looking at my images from the World Championships, of course there's all this other current that goes through gymnastic, which is about national pride and national competition and world powers, which is so apparent in the A to Z. And in this particular competition, as an artist I was looking at my images of which ones are interesting, which ones do the colours work, which ones are not so literal that I can kind of identify with. But I noticed that the images I pulled out, the yellows and the reds and the blacks, also were the same colours as Rodchenko's pure colours. And this is something that's already in my sketchbook, you know, these coincidences that happen. And then I thought, well, India, and so this one here is Space Force Construction number 3, India. And you know, there's these emerging superpowers. And I chose it because it was black on black, and I was really interested on this kind of almost, the gymnasts almost melting into the space of the arena. But they're also, you know, there's China, there's America. So I kind of felt like all these things were coming together somehow, and so I constructed these sculptures to frame them and project them and cluster them together. And again, really to invite you to look at them differently. I don't want them to be looked at as a document of a particular event. They are a document of a particular event, but it's also a chance to kind of think differently about kind of the human form and physicality of the human being.
Yes, yes.
You started off with the whippets, and they are considered muscle in a specific form, and then you moved on to this. Are you particularly affected by the muscles?
Well,
It just seems,
it's very interesting that you ask that, because when I was making the whippet work, I was approached by a choreographer at the National Ballet. I think it was National Ballet, really interested in me working with these dancers, and I'd actually been approached by somebody in Wales as well, who was interested in making the dancers. And I did consider it, and maybe I will, but one of the reasons I chose gymnastics was I'm really interested in kind of popular culture, and there's something slightly different about gymnastics to ballet. Although I think both are art forms, both are incredibly difficult, but gymnastics is a competition. And there's some kind of brutal aspect that brings in, you know. It is all about the winning, you know, that training is about pulling it off and holding your nerve. The whippet owners, it was all about the winning as well. You know, obviously they have great relationships with their dogs generally, but those whippet owners that perform, you know, in the show ring, it's all about the winning. So I'm really interested in these subcultures, and an individual gymnast has to conform to these rules and regulations. It's competition, there are rules. Ballet can be more expressive, dance can be more expressive, and yet, within those very tightly codified rules, you know, if you step out of line, you lose a mark. If you fall over, you lose a mark. If you don't produce the right difficulty, you don't. So you've got to juggle all these things. And yet the gymnasts who succeed are those who kind of conform to this very strict regime in a team and, are compliant, but also somehow find a way to shine and to be individual. And I think that kind of brings me on to kind of what I'm really interested in my work with the dogs and with the gymnasts is these little subcultures also kind of are a mirror into kind of human societies. And the Russian constructivists as well, it was all about society and the masses, and you know, the individual no longer counts. But we are all individuals, and it's kind of, what happens to the individual? How do we learn to fit in? You know, how are we judged? How, you know, wherever you live, whether it's in a communist country or a capitalist country, or whether you're part of a dog show society, or whether you're a member of a gym club, you know, you kind of learn to work out where you fit in and how you personally work with that. So I'm really fascinated by the rules and the regulations, and it's quite revealing, I think, about how we learn to be in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to find, as you were saying that, I was trying to find a quote, which is in your book. Do you know it offhand? It's like the kind of introductory quote about perfection.
Nadia Comaneci.
Yes, exactly.
It's at the end of the book.
It's at the end of the book, okay. I couldn't remember where it was.
It's a fantastic quote.
It's a fantastic quote. I thought it, yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, Nadia Comaneci was a Romanian gymnast who in the 1976 Montreal Olympics produced the first perfect 10 score in gymnastics history. So it was a very historic moment, and she went on to reproduce several in the Olympics. And subsequently, the gymnastics code was changed so that it was much harder, or now almost impossible, to get get a perfect score, but she did, and she's kind of infamous for that. But she was interviewed many years later, and she'd defected to America, and I found this little quote. She said, "I don't believe in perfection. I achieved it under a certain system, but there was plenty of room for developing that system." And I kind of love that quote because it was both the modesty of, you know, she was an amazing gymnast and immaculate gymnast, which is why she pulled off that, under those particular rules, that kind of perfect score. But she highlighted the fact that it's all just about a system, and it's a system created by humans, and, you know, how interesting the moment it was achieved, the bar for perfection was raised, you know. So perfection is quite a fascinating thing. It's kind of very intangible, and it's almost like, maybe it's quite a sterile thing, you know, would it be interesting if we were all perfect? What is perfect? Maybe there's no such thing as perfect, but I think every subculture likes to have an idea of what maybe we're striving for. And certainly in photography, coming back to photography, that was another thing that I was interested in the starting point with the sports photographers. You know, what's their idea of perfection? What is a perfect photograph? Is it something that's, you know, for the gymnast? I know for the coach at Heathrow, where I was visiting artists for a while, I think for him a perfect photograph was one which showed his gymnasts with immaculate lines, perfectly sharp, quite literal. He liked the moves that were a document of something that was going on, but also images that I think he was familiar with, you know, good quality sports photographs.
Yes, and conventional in certain ways. But the relationship between gymnastics and photography is so lovely that way, because there's you sort of hold your breath, and there's the moment of some kind of leap where, you know, maybe less with digital in a certain kind of a way, but not really, you know. I mean, you kind of either make the move or you don't. You kind of either get the shot in that instant when you're trying to photograph something, or you fail, or it's just not interesting,
But photographs also creep up on you. I'm always surprised when people talk about photographs being you just press the button and that's it. You know, photography is easy. But actually, you know, I'm very slow photographer. I like to work on stuff and then have it sitting there and kind of simmering a bit, and things kind of speak to you slowly. Sometimes things leap out and think, there's something interesting there, but you might not know what it is, or things kind of come to you slowly. And I think one of the funny things about digital now is that, you know, you can very quickly take a shot and delete it if it's not right. Whereas an old contact sheet, you know, it would all be there, and actually, years later you go back and you realise that the interesting shots are the ones that you weren't looking at originally.
Yes.
So that was another reason why I wanted to try and shoot differently, but also look at which would be the ones they would get rid of. You know, why would they get rid of these?
Yes. One of your images from Heathrow is suspension. Is that
Suspension right? Is the vinyl piece in the small gallery.
Yes. Everyone's had a chance to look at that piece, which is a sort of geometric installation in its own right, and so related to the rest of the work in lots of ways, but also in certain ways a much more garish sort of image in the way that it's been blown up and sort of pixelated, and also in the way that you can see the kind of concentrated expression on the gymnast's face. And you've told me a little bit about you told me that the coach hated that image, which is interesting.
Yes, I actually shot that image fairly early on when I was going to Heathrow weekly, and trying to get my head around the camera, which was multiple menus, and trying to see it. Very clever camera, but it couldn't cope with the speed of the gymnast, so the sports program didn't work, and you know, I ended up doing everything manually. But I was kind of just experimenting with the camera, and I was showing the coach one or two of the images, and I showed him that one because that's one that really, right from the start, I just thought there's something there that really interested me. And one of the things was she was in the middle of a very fast twisting somersault, and yet to look at the image you wouldn't know. It looks like she's just gently floating over the top of the gym with all the younger girls kind of leaping around underneath. And her face is actually really serene, and you think this is actually mid-twist, mid-somersault, you know, what is she doing? And then her hand is completely out of line, and that's why the coach didn't like it. He said, that's an ugly hand. It's a very interesting hand.
It's a very interesting hand.
And, you know, and how, you know, I think it was I can't remember exactly, but it was 6,400 ISO. So now cameras work at a much higher ISO, but then it was like state of the art. But, and I can't remember, but a fraction of a second. So, you know, that poor girl may have only raised her hand in that position for a millisecond, who knows, but it was caught by my camera. And that's all the coach could see was the hand that was out of line. But for me, that was the hand that made the image so interesting. It's a serene expression, this hand kind of almost pointing upwards. And, you know, I was thinking, where is she? Where's her... What's she thinking? Is she thinking? Is she just kind of instinctively just somewhere else and just letting the body do it? There's something...
Have you had conversations with many of the gymnasts that you shot?
No, because one of the kind of unwritten rules of the visiting artist thing was, you know, Heathrow's American Gymnastics Club, and they probably get a lot of approaches.
Yeah.
They don't normally let people in, and I kind of, you know, persuaded him to allow me to be there, and the deal was that I really would just be there and experience it and mop up the atmosphere and watch the girls, and I filmed them and I photographed them, but I didn't interfere. You know, this was the elite squad, they trained every night of the week, and what I didn't want to do is to start chatting with them and distracting them, because I knew it was a surefire way I would be straight out the door.
Yeah.
So, and the only time when I first arrived, I was introduced to them, obviously, and over the time that I was with them, I had 5 minutes with each girl twice. And I set up, and I also only had a couple of hours to actually set up and get out of the building. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I found out after I set up that the floor was sprung in the studio I was shooting at. So the gym itself was completely sprung and chalky and kind of fabulous, but very low light. It was an industrial estate just outside Heathrow. The lights were way up. There was natural light, there was strip light, there was tungsten light, so a photographer's nightmare, and no directional light at all, and chalk going everywhere with the camera, and girls flying everywhere, and they didn't spend long on each apparatus. Their way of training was quite interesting to me. Very short periods on each apparatus and they moved on, so you could never really get an idea of what they were going to be doing to plan anything much. But with the 5 minutes with each girl, I did, although I was obviously trying to use my time very economically and productively, I did get to chat a little bit. But I also wanted to brief them on what it was I wanted them to do. So there was no chit-chat. So no, and that, in a way I found that quite interesting, because working with the dogs, there was no chit-chat. You know, the breeders thing, but there was an engagement with the camera, and I really liked that. And the dogs really loved the camera, and you know, you could see them, they were quite different creatures with the camera. In fact, I didn't talk to them. I talked to them through the camera lens, but they would look at the lens and they would, you know, it wasn't like, you know, photographing the dog just being there. They were real little performers, the dogs. They really came alive with the camera. In fact, William Wakeman told me the same happened to him. His dogs just transformed when he worked with big Polaroid. The dogs would just know. He'd cock the lens and the dogs would immediately know that's when they looked at the camera. It's quite fascinating, and I had that experience too.
I'm quite sure that humans are just the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, don't you think?
Yeah.
We know when there's a camera. You know?
And these gymnasts, you know, I had 5 minutes, and I also was making some video works, which I haven't been able to use because the floor was so sprung, and I wanted them doing particular things, which obviously the floor was sprung, so it didn't work so well. But although I only had 5 minutes, I gave them quite concise instructions, and they were so professional. They just performed like the dogs. They performed to order. In fact, they were slightly more obedient than the dogs. Beautifully. So it was a productive time, even though I had a very That's actually a young gymnast from Heathrow. And the second time I saw them, I asked each of them to perform one of their warm-up moves that I'd seen them doing. A little bit like what I asked the gymnasts from Bangor to do for the opening night event here. I've noticed that Lucy's here in the background there. So very much like I asked Lucy to perform for the opening, but that was obviously live. These girls, I gave them each one move and I asked them to perform it, and this one for me was the one that immediately stood out. And in fact, this girl initially produced the move more parallel, and it was just an amazing shot. And just as I thought she'd finished, she kind of ducked her head under and became even more tense and tight, and that's the shot that I've shown.
Oh, and this was a whole series that you did, obviously.
Yes, so I have lots of other images, which I haven't used in the show.
Yeah.
Although I'm going to produce an artist book for the girls, which I have done with each of the different moves. It's kind of like it's a constellation book with Hubble's system of galaxies wrapped around it. But it didn't feel right to show too much of this show because it made it too literal and too about showing a portrait of all the girls, which this isn't what this is about for me. So
no, those works feel much more formal in a different way to me as well. They have a very different sort of aesthetic, or the aesthetic is in the composition rather than in the installation.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It's also the only work that's actually shot on film. It's on a medium format camera, so the quality of the image is much better. But I originally started making these because I wanted to give the gymnasts something that would be different for them. You know, film is always slower and a different quality. But ironically, I did show these to the coach and he really didn't like them. He said, "Oh, I think they're for you." And I'm thinking, "No, I did them for you." So that was again.
What was his criticism of them in these cases? Because the poses seem quite technically.
I don't know that I showed him the second set. I showed him the first set where they're presenting, which are also some of them in the book. I don't think it was that. I think it was I made the outfits. So normally they wear very colourful, modern, but this is the same style outfit they would wear to training, but I just made them white because I wanted it to be about the girls with their incredible physiques.
Yes.
You know, young girls have never had physiques like this before, and it's because of the training and the demands. You know, they do incredible things at very young ages now. Gymnastics moves on very fast, and you know, the things that the juniors are doing now wouldn't have appeared in the Olympics in the 50s and 60s. You know, it's just
of course. And
incredible.
We were talking earlier. There's one pose particularly within A to Z that looks so impossible, and for me, it brought to mind the idea of foot binding, of a kind of almost torturing your body to doing something that
As a Chinese gymnast.
that it shouldn't normally be able to do. So there's also that tension around the idea of perfection, especially with very young athletes, and the kind of potentially almost sinister sort of pushing that happens in the sport.
And I found, it was really interesting for me being like embedded in it.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't sure, it was a very long time since I trained.
Yes.
And the Cold War was still on, and we had a few defected. I had a Czech coach in Chelmsford, and then I had a Russian.
Bring back all of that kind of stress or excitement?
The excitement. It was very different, but I was really happily surprised to see there was a discipline in the gym, which I really enjoyed, but it was also very supportive. The girls really supported each other, very positive. I didn't know what to expect, and I was prepared for anything, and I thought it was a very positive environment. But getting back to this image, I think maybe it is more like photography. It's a classic photographic portrait that maybe would be understood in photography circles. And I think maybe the reason I didn't want to show a whole series was I felt that it could be quite boring for me, even though they're lovely, the portraits. But I think for me that one says it all, and it's enough. So.
Well, when I first met you and we met in your studio, it was that piece which was hanging behind you in the space, and I remember asking you whether you were influenced by certain kind of, earlier, more formal, modernist kind of photographers like Avedon or Irving Penn or Richard Avedon, who made sort of studio photographs that that have those kinds of qualities, and it had never occurred to you before.
No.
So that was quite interesting, and it's very different from the other works, but at the same time, there is a quality that's sort of in the construction of the pose itself is something that and the control of it is something that is not necessarily in the poses in the rest of your images, but you've done something where you kind of regain that control in the way that you've chosen to install them, which I think is interesting. So they still have this very geometric and controlled sort of sensibility.
Yeah, it was really important there was very little control in this project, which was quite scary. So once I got this kind of archive of images and stuff from the World Championships, stuff from Heathrow, I then kind of took back control in how I made the artworks and what I did with them. And that was, I think, the only way that I could feel again that I was creating something that I was really happy with and contributing something to the work as well.
Can you talk a little bit about Pinnacle?
Pinnacle is the one at the back with the legs. And it's a counterpoint to Peak, which is the individual gymnast. And
don't miss the stray element.
There's an 11th framed image right up in the eaves. And for me, that piece was something about trying to kind of sum up everything about gymnastics, the kind of the aspirational, almost Soviet-style kind of optimism of those early works where you see kind of young, healthy, fit athletes presenting very uplifting works. So from a distance it's very uplifting because all the legs are shooting upwards. It was shot, again, mainly in the vault, but at the World Championships, so different disciplines. And I've also, the way I've installed it, interlocking frames, and it's big, you have to look up to see it, it's very physical. I was actually thinking of Leni Riefenstahl's mountain films, very nationalistic mountain films, where she was an actress then, she was actually a climber, climbed barefoot, it was amazing. She scaled these heights, literally. It was very kind of daredevil. But the whole films were very sentimental and sickly, and they're all about, nationalism. So I was trying to kind of include that, but also the very kind of heavy metal frames are slightly clash with the kind of the detail in the images, which, when you look closer, they're all flesh-coloured, but there is bandages and spray on skin. And these are, again, elite gymnasts at their peak. Physical, they're there performing in World Championships, and yet you can see the strain on the body, and it does reveal more about the physical pressures as well as maybe the emotional pressures of training at that standard and performing at that level. So it was a counterpoint to this young, fresh, taut body of the young gymnast from Heathrow.
I mean, there's a way in which they're dehumanized, aren't they? I mean, all of them are to a certain extent. They really become these sculptural objects, and they're so formed in a way. They're so constructed as bodies.
It's very funny you should say dehumanized, because I think one of the things I was trying to do with these works, and how would it be different to the sports photographers, I was wanting to show maybe the raw, emotional, passional feeling.
Yes.
So I did chop off their heads and bodies. And
yes.
So, but I kind of did it in I don't know, it's very hard to look at your own work, and I have lots of feelings about it, but a lot of them are related to the making and the experience of making, which is sometimes incidental to the end work. So it's hard to know how other people will experience them when they see
but
them.
there's a tension between, I guess, between those two things in a way in this work. I mean, because of the way that you've chosen to let them be a bit blurred or a little bit off to the side.
Oh, I should talk about that.
You get
Yes.
the feeling of momentum and you get the feeling of the effort.
And that was deliberate. I did actually have more images in focus that I could have used. So part of me was really terrified that people would just think, that I'm a really rubbish photographer and don't know how to take this picture. I know a lot of photographers probably will think that because I am a bit of a rubbish photographer, but I deliberately wanted those slightly blurry ones, and they are cropped, to answer your very earlier question. It's just it's a digital SLR, it's not a huge megapixel frame, and they are cropped to the crop I wanted. So some of them are blown up, and then blown up really quite big. So the image itself is struggling, it's fragmenting as a digital image, and then the actual focus in some of them, is a bit blurry because either they were moving or I didn't, I was shooting into the roof of the arena and manually focusing, and they were moving very fast, so it was quite hit and miss. But as I say, I chose ones that were more in focus, and it immediately looked very fixed and rigid and wrong, and there was something a little bit more ethereal and fragile about the ones that were slightly wrong. And it kind of comes back to this, what is perfection? For me, I really like that piece. It's all wrong, but it kind of works perfectly. So.
Well, and the most sort of serene, stable bit of it is at the very top. So there's always this idea for me in this work that perfection can't exist because if it did, there would be nowhere else to go.
Yes.
And the work is about kind of maybe just other ways of seeing these bodies and moving in a slightly different direction, thinking about different ideals of beauty or of perfection. But I wonder if other people have comments or questions about the work.
Thinking about what you were saying about perfection, I was interested during the Olympics, they spoke to all the corporate and now they comment separately. They both said that these movements called after people, like Paul Flickr, it's not people sitting down and theoretically thinking, let's really move. It's someone doing a move and making a mistake during it. And then they think, oh, that's quite interesting. Perhaps we could develop that into another move. So it's really all about happy accidents, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the whole thing evolves. And I suppose I saw a clipping of somebody in the 60s doing something completely different dramatically. It looked like almost different art form because presumably it didn't have those elements in it that have come to.
And the happy accidents, it's a really good point actually, and I didn't hear Nadia Kopic this time, but I heard her talk about it before. A lot of her most famous moves were trying to perform a certain move and making a slightly wrong one and evolving that. And I think that's quite a good reference for making artwork as well. If you know exactly what you're doing, how to do it perfectly, and your film is pristine and your print is perfect and the colour's perfect, it can be quite boring, And it's when things go a little bit wrong, or you've forgotten to put the larger light on, or you've stood something the wrong way up, or that's when or things get kind of put together by accident. That's when things kind of start happening. So it was really nice to hear that comment about how it happens. Change is good. Accidents are good. I think it's once it's performed, if it hasn't been performed before, it then gets named after the gymnast who first performed it. And then people will perform it and it gets a point allocation. But then people evolve it again, and if it's evolved sufficiently differently, they then get the move named after that. Which is nice, because it provides this kind of continuous history.
But it made me think, I don't know, the same amount about ballet. That's how ballet has also evolved historically. It's different people bringing in different elements and whatever that have then taken off and been incorporated.
I think it's an interesting paradigm in almost any kind of human invention, isn't it? I mean, if you think about even cures for diseases and in inventions, lots of inventions. They're often people are trying to do something completely different, and they do something by accident, and it ends up.
But they're trying for something. That's also that's where perfection can be productive. Yes. They're trying to do something better or higher or faster or something, and then something different happens.
Something different happens because it's impossible to ever fully understand kind of what's possible in a way, I guess, or our own limitations, or interesting. Does anybody else have any thoughts about the work or questions about it?
What you said there about that's when perfection can be interesting. So it's almost kind of sounds like it's not perfection. That's not what you're interested in. It's the human error, or it's the failure.
Imperfection is fascinating. I'm sure that's really what interests me. But
it shows a human, or it shows that individuality then, doesn't it? Kind of general perfection.
I would be really fascinated now. I'm sorry that Heathrow's a very long way from here, but I would love to have the Heathrow gymnasts here and Vince, the coach, to see what how they experience this work now. Because I think it was a very big leap to show them a few rough printouts. But it's really nice to have Lucy, before Lucy's other gymnast from Bangor here, to kind of perform with me as well.
Was anybody here at the opening able to see these performances, other than Lucy, obviously? Yeah. I've only seen installation images of them, but so beautiful, particularly with the architecture of the space as well. So again, these really interesting lines all around, which kind of contribute these different layers to the work.
I'd just like to make a comment. All the time you've been speaking, Joe, you're looking at that photograph behind you, the one nearest you. I'm just amazed by the position of those hands, because as if she's swimming through the air.
The hands are just, I think probably I have a body of work, both from the dog work and this work, where I've got a whole collection of images where I might crop the hands and do something with the hands and feet. I think they're very underutilised. I think obviously if you have a portrait, people look to the face and the eyes, but the gymnasts' physiques, their hands and feet are so expressive. It's quite incredible, and quite. You wouldn't imagine that they would be like that.
If you have another look at the suspension as well, it's almost as though in some of these, sometimes the hands are in some kind of perfect posture, but it's almost as though they can't help the reflex of this just little show, physical show of the momentum.
But you also have to somehow twist to get around. How do you twist otherwise?
I know.
It's impossible to just be completely streamlined.
It is. It's totally impossible. It's completely impossible. So we are both, very luckily for us, going to go to Toronto to celebrate the launch of this prize, which Joe's been nominated for, which is wonderful, the Grange Prize. Please do, I would say again, have a look. If you Google Grange Prize, you can find the website and look at all the artists who are
not too hard.
We're not too I have to be impartial. I have to be impartial. But it'll be really interesting to see some of this work installed in a different space, because of course I think you've worked really closely with the architecture as well, and that's a big part of this work is installing the work so that it somehow has a real relationship with the lines and the dimensions that are already there.
It's such a wonderful gallery. I'm just really privileged to have been able to put the work here. It's just wonderful.
Do you think, Joe, you're going to go to Pinnacle next week with this show? What kind of difference is it?
It's going to be quite a different, it's the same work, it's going to be quite a different show. First and foremost, the space is much lower and actually much larger. So Pinnacle doesn't fit, so I'm reconfiguring Pinnacle, so it will be slightly different formation. And suspension, vinyl piece, Turner House in Penarth is quite an old building and doesn't have the immaculate smooth walls that Moskin has here. So it seemed unwise to put vinyl on a kind of slightly more bobbly wall. So, and also I've got much bigger space, so I can't put it in kind of the geometric form I've used here. So I'm actually printing it as a C-type print, so the colours will be much more vibrant, more detailed. And I'm mounting 3 panels, the same, mounting on aluminium, and I'm painting it black. And it's going to hang off the central beam in space, and we're painting the whole room charcoal. And it's going to be lit. So it's going to be more astral. It's going to be quite, and you'll be able to walk around it. So it's going to be quite different to here.
Would you see it as the same piece then? Would you see it as the same piece, or we present it differently, or
I think it's the same piece. I mean, although my work's very precise and thought through quite rigorously in terms of installation, I do find wherever I go, the architecture in the space kind of speaks to you, and you sometimes I'll just reconfigure the hanging, and so they work to the same rules, and they are the same piece, but they just look different. So it's quite nice. It evolves, a bit like the gymnastics moves, it evolves. And some spaces can be difficult, but other spaces really provide different opportunities that you wouldn't have had. And you know, you can mix works together in different ways just because, I mean, here, I really wanted Pinnacle and Peak together, but you have the doors, so they are together, but they're not. But those doors are so amazing, it also brings it all together as well. In Photo Gallery, I'm going to have the space walls constructed all together and clustered together more. So there's a long line that you'll see down because the central alleyway is open. It's an open space. And I think you'll be able to see through all the frameworks together. So you get the 3 colours together, which will be a different experience to here. So it's going to look different. And I might be working with local gymnastics, and I haven't approached them yet, but I will think of maybe doing something different with them as well. So. There's going to be another gymnastics intervention which the girls are curating themselves, which is fantastic. So I don't know the exact date of that yet, but it will be on the Moskin website. Yeah.
They're going to perform in this space.
Yes. Or somewhere in the gallery. But yes, they're going to use the geometric maps and the leotards that I provided them with, but they're going to do their own development of the opening night performance. So that's really nice. It's like the evolution of the artwork. Yeah, it's got a life of its own now. Yes, and I'm really looking forward to seeing some documentation.
That would be a beautiful, beautiful way to kind of end this.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, should we retire to a glass of prosecco and talk more informally?